The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union's performance in the 20th century completely outshines that of Japan. There's no comparison.
According to a U.S. official, Vladimir Putin has been getting bad info from his advisors regarding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We believe that Putin is being misinformed by his advisors about how badly the Russian military is performing, and how the Russian economy is being crippled by sanctions because his senior advisors are too afraid to tell him the truth, the official said, citing declassified intelligence. I have no idea if this is true in this specific case, but I do know that this sort of thing is fairly common when it comes to bureaucracy. People within bureaucracies are oftentimes better off not reporting bad results and making everything look good to their higher-ups. Of course, this doesn't make the problems go away. In fact, it usually makes things worse. But the official within the bureaucracy is usually personally better off. If this sort of thing is going on in Vladimir Putin's Russia, this wouldn't be the first time this sort of thing happened in that country's history. This is exactly what helped lead to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The Chernobyl power plant is in Ukraine, which in 1986 was de facto ruled by the Kremlin. In case you weren't familiar with the details, in April of 1986 there was a meltdown at the nuclear power plant, and significant portions of radiation were released across the Soviet Union and Western Europe in the 2 weeks that followed. In terms of death count, the Chernobyl disaster is considered to be the worst nuclear accident in the history of the planet. Most Americans my age and younger probably heard about the Chernobyl disaster from the titular HBO miniseries. The series, which, as I understand, is a pretty faithful adaptation of what really happened, though I cannot say because I haven't seen it, was released in 2019, and at the time was meant to be a criticism of then-President Donald Trump. The bureaucratic cover-up, which prolonged the crisis, was supposed to be a critique of the 45th president's supposed unwillingness to hear bad news. Maybe so, but as Kyle Smith at National Review explained, it works far better as a critique of socialism. Chernobyl is a warning about a completely contained state looking after its own interests instead of its people's, with little cause to worry that anyone might go off script because the price to be paid for this is known to all. As the political head of the energy department, Boris Sherbina, played by Stellan Skarsgård, says to physicist Ulana Komiuk, Emily Watson, when she threatens to blow the whistle on the cover-up, "I've known braver souls than you, Chomiuk, men who had their moment and did nothing. Because when it's your life and the lives of everyone you love, your moral conviction doesn't mean anything, and all you want at that moment is not to be shot." The only reason the world started to find out what was happening at Chernobyl was that wind-borne nuclear fallout, unlike information, cannot be bottled up. When contamination started showing up in Sweden, the world's scientists started to grasp the reality. When Destiny debated Marxist economist Richard Wolff, Destiny had a pretty clever one-liner.
I think that you would have an easier time blaming Chernobyl on socialism than you would the coronavirus response on capitalism. That's all I'm saying.
Exactly. That's exactly what you're saying. I see that.
Thank you.
You see, Richard Wolff is pretty slippery when it comes to defining socialism. He's probably best known for being an advocate for worker-run cooperatives. The channel he's affiliated with on YouTube is called Democracy at Work, where Wolff and others rail against capitalism and argue for a form of socialism supposedly distinct from that of the 20th century despotic forms. The thing is, when it suits his purposes, Wolff will invoke aspects of these regimes to help demonstrate the superiority of socialism over capitalism.
In the 20th century, the fastest growing metric, the fastest growing GDP in any country measured was the Soviet Union. And in the 21st century we're living in, the fastest growing GDP in the world has been the People's Republic of China. This is not an endorsement of one or another economic system. It's a statement of fact verified by any reliable source of information. The UN, the projects in the University of California, Berkeley, and others who keep track of this. So this has to be understood because in much of the world, economic growth is a shared objective and goal that these two societies have excelled at achieving.
So first off, he's talking about two very different things, neither of which were the implementation of worker-run cooperatives. The first is Russia's economic transformation from a post-feudal agrarian economy to a centrally planned industrialized one. The second period Wolff invoked happened when China embraced market reforms to their centrally planned economy. We'll be examining the first period today, and, as we'll see, the sort of bureaucratic cover-ups that made the Chernobyl disaster so much worse were very much present in collectivized Soviet agriculture. And much like Chernobyl, the results were disastrous for the people who lived there. The early Soviet Union had the good fortune of inheriting an advanced statistic-keeping infrastructure. Despite its massive size and relative backwardness, Tsarist Russia employed some of the most sophisticated and well-developed statistical agencies in all the world. The most notable of which was the Central Statistical Committee. Lenin, who had studied pre-revolutionary statistics, became convinced that having reliable data was incredibly important for policymaking. He consolidated the pre-revolutionary agencies into the Central Statistical Administration. Upon taking power after Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin began the transition from war communism to central planning through the implementation of 5-year plans, the most consequential of which was the collectivization of agriculture. These statistical agencies played an important role in this, because along with the collectivization came the distortion of the official numbers. As S.G. Wheatcroft and R.W. Davies wrote in their essay, The Crooked Mirror of Soviet Economic Statistics, the Soviet authorities sought to know the truth about the economic situation in the country, particularly in relation to successes and failures in pursuing their key priorities. But they also sought to reward achievements and penalize failure with the aid of their knowledge of the quantitative results achieved by individual economic units, and by whole sectors of the economy. This gave strong incentives for participants in the system at every level to exaggerate their reported results, and the central authorities were not always able to correct this deficiency adequately. Moreover, the central authorities and their competing interests within the party, and within the state apparatus, were all willing to distort statistics in their own interests. The authorities also used their statistics to publicize the achievements of the Soviet system to the world, which people like Richard Wolff continue to repeat uncritically, by the way. Published statistics therefore suffered a further distortion as compared with internal statistics for official use. Soviet successes were exaggerated, and failures minimized or simply omitted from the published record. Stalin's reign was notorious for its purges. If you're a bureaucrat working within the system, you're better off lying to get rewarded, rather than telling the truth, which might get you killed or sent to a gulag. Of course, none of this put food on the table, even if the official numbers showed a strong harvest. The collectivization of agriculture in the first 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932 proved to be a disastrous failure. As Davies and Wheatcroft wrote in their essay on collectivization of Soviet agriculture, agricultural production, and particularly production used for human food and animal fodder, declined very substantially in 1928 to 1932. Even by the end of the 1930s, gross agricultural production had barely recovered to the level of the mid-1920s. According to the official figures, as estimated in the 1960s, in 1940 it exceeded the 1928 level by a mere 2.5%. Our provisional estimates reach similar conclusions. Agricultural production increased less rapidly than population growth, which was about 12% in this period. This poor performance happened despite the advantages of collectivization, such as economies of scale, and the replacement of much of the old farm equipment with mechanized versions, such as switching to tractor plows from horse-drawn versions. The main reasons for this poor performance were that there was little incentive for peasants to put a lot of work into collectivized farms, especially given that the central government took the vast majority of the harvest yield and distributed it themselves. Also, the implementation of much of the collectivization effort was conducted by people who had little or no knowledge of actual farming. The overwhelming majority of these people came from cities and had worked in administration, teaching, or some other branch of the economy. Even with training and experience, their level of expertise never matched those who had been doing it their entire lives. After 1932, though, during the second 5-year plan, grain output rose significantly. This wasn't due to some dramatic improvement, though. It was because they started measuring things differently. As Davies and Wheatcroft wrote, in official Soviet statistics from 1933 onwards, grain output was measured, without any indication that this was the case, not as the harvest which reached barns, but in terms of biological yield. This was the maximum possible yield of the standing crop in the fields at the time of maximum ripeness. Biological harvest made no allowance for losses between field and barn, but in reality, losses amounted to 15% or so at best. They rose to over 30%. So, rather than actually improving the output of the collectivized farms, Soviet bureaucrats simply changed the way they measured things so as to satisfy their quotas. This wasn't just a mere case of fudging the numbers, though. The downstream effects of this change in measurement were catastrophic. In response to this new form of measurement, in order to satisfy quotas, collective farms started to abandon crop rotation, a farming practice wherein no crops are grown on a field for a season so as to preserve the health of the soil. This would make crop yields appear to be larger given that more land was being sown, and that's how things were measured under biological yield. However, it did enormous damage to the soil, and weaker soil means smaller yields overall. Given that outputs appeared to be larger on paper, state seizure of crops only increased. This left farmers with even less food for themselves, of course, but also less food for their animals. Thus, the livestock population decreased dramatically. This hurt farms in two ways. Despite the introduction of tractors, lots of farms still relied on horse-drawn plows. With fewer beasts of burden at their disposal, farmers were not able to plow their fields as efficiently, leading to even smaller crop yields. Second, less livestock meant less manure that could be used as fertilizer, thus damaging the nitrogen-depleted soil, leading to even smaller crop yields. These problems compounded on one another, leading to famines that caused millions of deaths, and it was all thanks to government policy. As Davies and Wheatcroft wrote, over and above the general disadvantages of central regulation of agricultural technology and farming practices, the factor which outweighed all others was the squeeze imposed on agricultural output. As Janzi put it, collective farming was introduced and has developed under such unfavorable conditions in the Soviet Union that it would have failed even if it were, per se, a perfectly sound undertaking. It was only after the death of Stalin in 1952 and the subsequent reduction of compulsory deliveries that the permanent weaknesses of the centralized control of agriculture eventually became clearly visible. Remember this the next time you see some meme about how capitalism produces food for profit and socialism produces food for people to eat. One economic system puts incentives in place for people to actually produce food, the other one doesn't. It's not that there aren't bureaucratic cover-ups outside of the government. There certainly are, and there are negative consequences to those as well. The thing is, there is no private company that has the power the government does. The government can lock you up and use violence against you. No company is legally allowed to do that. Under socialism, these bureaucratic cover-ups are institutionalized. They will metastasize to every part of the economy the government touches.